You stand on the rolling deck, the creak of timber a constant companion. Above you, sails billow against an endless sky, while below, the deep blue stretches out, vast and indifferent. The sun beats down, relentlessly reflecting off the water's surface, and a salty breeze stings your lips. Days blend into weeks, then into months, far beyond the sight of land. Around you, an entire world of water shimmers, beautiful and deadly, for every single drop is undrinkable. You are surrounded by liquid, yet the very real threat of thirst hangs heavy in the air. How did these brave mariners, embarking on voyages lasting half a year or even longer, possibly survive this most fundamental and terrifying challenge? We will uncover their astonishing methods. You breathe in the sharp, salty air, feeling the rhythm of the waves beneath your feet. This immense expanse, this boundless blue desert, is both awe-inspiring and terrifying. For millennia, humanity has looked to the sea for sustenance, for trade, for adventure. But for every voyage, from the earliest Polynesian canoes to the great age of sail, one fundamental life-sustaining element remained elusive: fresh water. Imagine stepping aboard a wooden ship, knowing you might not see land for 6 months, perhaps even a year. The most critical cargo, more valuable than gold or spices, was the water itself. Without it, survival was impossible. The primary solution, simple in concept, complex in execution, was to carry it. Vast quantities of fresh water were loaded onto ships, stored in sturdy wooden casks and barrels. These containers, often made from oak, were sealed as tightly as possible, filled to the brim with water drawn from shore wells or rivers. But the ocean is a relentless adversary, and time, its silent accomplice. Even the best sealed casks could not fully protect their precious contents. Within weeks, sometimes even days, the water would begin to spoil. You might notice a subtle change first, a faint, musty odor emanating from the bunghole. Then the color would shift from clear and inviting to a murky brown or green. Algae, bacteria, and other microorganisms, thriving in the stagnant darkness of the barrels, would transform the once pure liquid into a foul, slimy broth. Sailors often described it as thick, slimy, and emitting a stench that would make your stomach churn. Worms and insects would sometimes find their way in, adding to the grotesque cocktail. Picture yourself, desperate for a drink, holding out your cup as a shipmate ladles out this putrid fluid. You close your eyes, trying to block out the sight and the smell, forcing yourself to swallow. This was not merely an unpleasant experience. Drinking such contaminated water often led to severe illness. Dysentery, typhoid, and other gastrointestinal diseases would sweep through the ship, weakening the crew, incapacitating them, and sometimes even leading to death. The very substance meant to sustain life could, in fact, hasten its end. To combat this spoilage, and to ensure what little fresh water they had lasted as long as possible, strict rationing was universally enforced. There was no casual pour from the tap here. Every drop was accounted for, every man given a precise, minimal allowance. The ship's quartermaster or a designated officer would oversee the daily distribution. You would queue up, your empty tin cup in hand, your throat already aching with thirst, waiting for your small measure. Perhaps a pint a day. Or less. A pint to sustain a man laboring under a hot sun, hauling ropes, climbing rigging, enduring the constant physical exertion of life at sea. A pint to cook with, if any was spared. A pint to wash with, which was often out of the question. You learned to make that small amount last. A sip to moisten your mouth, another to swallow, trying to make it stretch, trying to fool your body into believing it had enough. The constant, gnawing sensation of thirst became a permanent companion. Your mouth felt like sandpaper, your tongue thick and swollen. Your energy levels plummeted. Headaches were constant. The insidious creep of dehydration began to take hold. But the mariners of old, facing this relentless challenge, were not without ingenuity. They recognized that pure fresh water was a luxury, and that other liquids, while not ideal, could help stave off complete dehydration. This led to the widespread adoption of what many might consider an unexpected solution: alcohol. Beer in particular was a staple. Before modern brewing techniques and pasteurization, beer was often a weaker, less alcoholic beverage than we know today. It was also brewed with hops, which acted as a mild preservative. Large quantities of beer were loaded onto ships, sometimes more than water. While it still spoiled, it did so more slowly than pure water, and its alcoholic content offered a degree of antiseptic quality. For example, the British Royal Navy rationed beer to its sailors for centuries, believing it to be safer and more nutritious than stagnant water. Imagine your daily allowance consisting of a gallon of beer, in lieu of fresh water, especially during the early phases of a voyage. It was not just about the calories, it was about the liquid. Wine was another option, particularly in regions where it was abundant and cheap. Mediterranean ships, for instance, would carry substantial stores of wine. Like beer, its alcohol content offered some resistance to spoilage. But perhaps the most famous alcoholic solution to the water problem was rum. Or more specifically, grog. Grog was a concoction born of necessity and tradition. British Admiral Edward Vernon, nicknamed Old Grog, due to his preferred grogram cloak, ordered in 1740 that the daily rum ration be diluted with water. This was done primarily to prevent sailors from hoarding their rum and then becoming dangerously intoxicated. But it served another critical purpose on long voyages. It stretched the diminishing fresh water supply. By mixing 1 part rum with 4 parts water, and sometimes adding lime juice to prevent scurvy, sailors received a relatively safe, albeit alcoholic, drink. The strong flavor of rum also helped to mask the foul taste and smell of the brackish, stagnant water from the casks. You would taste the burn of the rum, the sour tang of the lime, and perhaps just a hint of the slime underneath. It was a daily ritual, a moment of reprieve, a small comfort in a harsh existence. Beyond the barrels and the grog, sailors also looked to the sky for salvation. Rainwater harvesting was a simple yet profoundly effective method, whenever nature permitted. During squalls or sustained rainfall, sails would be unfurled or tarpaulins spread out to catch the downpour. The collected water would then be channeled into waiting barrels. Imagine the collective cheer that would erupt on deck as the first drops of a genuine cleansing rain began to fall after weeks of drought. Every available bucket, every pot, every canvas sheet would be deployed. This was truly fresh water, pure and invigorating, a temporary balm for parched throats and weary souls. But rain was unpredictable. Weeks could pass under a clear, relentless sky, leaving this method utterly useless. Attempts were also made at distillation. The concept of boiling seawater and condensing the steam to produce fresh water was understood even in ancient times. However, doing this effectively and efficiently on a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean was a monumental challenge. Early stills were cumbersome, required vast amounts of fuel for the fire, and produced only small quantities of fresh water. Imagine the sheer logistics. You needed a constant, roaring fire below deck, consuming precious timber, risking fire aboard a wooden vessel, all for a mere trickle of drinkable water. It was often a last resort or a supplement for medical emergencies, rather than a primary source. The fuel alone often outweighed the benefit, meaning it was rarely a sustainable solution for an entire crew over months. The desperation for water could drive men to extreme measures. When all else failed, when the casks were dry, the beer was sour, the grog was gone, and the skies remained stubbornly clear, the true horror of the blue desert revealed itself. Dehydration led to delirium, hallucinations, and eventually death. Stories from the open sea are replete with accounts of sailors succumbing to thirst, their bodies found shriveled and cracked, their eyes wide with unseeing madness. Sometimes, the temptation to drink seawater became overwhelming, despite the universal knowledge that it would only accelerate death, drawing out the agony. The high salt content in seawater draws moisture from the body, exacerbating dehydration rather than alleviating it. A sip becomes a gulp becomes a desperate draught, and the end comes faster, more painfully. These mariners therefore lived on a knife edge. Their survival depended on a delicate balance of careful planning, strict discipline, resourceful improvisation, and an unyielding will to endure. The methods they employed, from the careful management of foul-smelling barrels to the daily ritual of grog, underscore the sheer brutality of their existence and the profound challenge that simply staying hydrated presented on the vast, indifferent ocean. They transformed the very definition of drinkable, pushed the boundaries of human endurance, and in doing so, laid the foundation for global exploration and trade. You look out at the endless waves, reflecting on the generations who faced this fundamental test. The sun still beats down. The salty breeze still stings. But now, you understand the silent, unseen struggle that accompanied every nautical mile, every new horizon discovered. The ocean, magnificent and powerful, demanded its tribute, and often, that tribute was paid in the agonies of thirst. You stand on the deck, the sun beating down, and you can almost feel the dry itch in your throat, the parched longing that gnawed at every sailor for centuries. Imagine a world where fresh water, the most fundamental necessity for life, was the rarest and most precious commodity of all. It was not gold or jewels that truly held the power of survival on the high seas. It was the humble, life-giving liquid, measured out in miserly drops. Your eyes scan the vast, empty horizon. There is water everywhere, an infinite expanse, yet none of it is drinkable. This paradox was the daily reality for men who pushed the boundaries of the known world. They embarked on journeys that stretched not for days or weeks, but for months, sometimes years, into an ocean that offered no solace to their thirst. How did they endure? How did they keep their bodies functioning, their minds sharp enough to navigate, to fight, to simply survive, when dehydration was a constant companion, a shadow lurking in every crevice of their existence? The answer lies in a combination of rigid discipline, remarkable resilience, and a profound understanding of scarcity. From the moment a ship left port, every man on board understood the unforgiving calculus of their water supply. Each barrel represented a finite reservoir of life. Consider the containers themselves. Before the age of metal, water was stored in wooden casks and barrels. You watch as a gang of sailors muscles a freshly filled barrel into the ship's hold. It is a painstaking process. The wood, typically oak, was chosen for its strength and relative impermeability, but it was far from perfect. Swelling and shrinking with temperature changes, seams would inevitably open, leading to leakage. Even worse, the wood itself imparted its own flavor to the water. Tannins leached out, giving the precious fluid a reddish tint and a bitter taste. But leakage was just the beginning of their troubles. Inside these wooden prisons, water quickly stagnated. Without refrigeration or modern purification, bacteria, algae, and other microorganisms flourished in the dark, still environment. You can almost smell it, a faint, growing odor of decay and sulfur, emanating from the depths of the hold. Imagine pouring yourself a drink from such a barrel after weeks at sea. The water would be turbid, cloudy with suspended matter. It might be green with algae, or perhaps a murky brown. Often, a slime formed on the surface, a testament to the thriving microbial ecosystem within. The taste was often described in truly horrific terms: putrid, slimy, brackish, even smelling of sewage. Sailors spoke of water that was so foul, it would make a dog vomit. Yet this was their only option. To refuse it was to court certain death. You lift the cup to your lips, holding your breath, trying to gulp it down before the stench can fully register, before the metallic, earthy, stagnant flavor can overwhelm your senses. To mitigate this, some ships attempted various primitive purification methods. They might pass the water through sand or charcoal filters, hoping to remove some of the visible impurities. Others would aerate it by pouring it from a height, believing this would freshen the water, though it did little to combat the bacterial load. You might see a sailor carefully decanting water from one bucket to another, a futile effort that speaks more to hope than to actual science. Rainwater offered a tantalizing, if unreliable, reprieve. During a squall, you can imagine the scramble on deck. Sails might be arranged to funnel the downpour into collecting barrels. Men would stand with buckets, eagerly catching every drop that fell. This fresh rain, though brief, was a blessed gift, a moment of pure, clean hydration amidst the daily struggle. But tropical downpours were unpredictable, and prolonged droughts at sea were common, leaving ships entirely dependent on their stored supply. The very concept of a ration took on a profound significance. Every day, often at a fixed time, the ship's purser or a designated officer would oversee the distribution of water. This was not a casual affair. It was a solemn, precise ritual. You stand in line with your messmates, your wooden dipper or tin cup in hand, your stomach churning with anticipation. The tension in the air is palpable. Each man knew exactly how much he was allotted, perhaps a single pint or even less for an entire day. This amount had to suffice for drinking, for cooking, and for any desperate attempts at personal hygiene. You watch as the officer meticulously measures out the ration. There is no room for error, no chance for an extra drop. The penalty for stealing water was severe, a testament to its value. The amount was just enough to keep a man from succumbing to outright dehydration, but never enough to truly quench the deep, persistent thirst that became an intrinsic part of life at sea. Your mouth feels perpetually dry, your lips cracked, your tongue thick. Then came the ingenuity born of desperation: grog. In the mid-18th century, Admiral Edward Vernon, nicknamed Old Grog because of his grogram cloak, introduced a mandatory daily ration of diluted rum. This was not merely an act of kindness. It was a pragmatic solution to several problems. Undiluted rum, given in daily tots, led to drunkenness and indiscipline. But diluting it with water served a dual purpose. It made the precious, dwindling fresh water supply more palatable, masking its foul taste and smell, and it stretched the overall liquid ration. You line up again, this time for grog. It is a mixture of rum, water, and sometimes a squeeze of lime or lemon juice. When available, a vital addition against scurvy. The rum provided a psychological boost, a momentary escape from the grim reality. The water, though diluted, was consumed more readily. Grog became more than just a drink. It was a daily ritual, a moment of camaraderie, a brief respite from the harshness of existence. You feel the warmth spread through your chest as you swallow the potent mixture, the acrid taste of the water momentarily forgotten beneath the fiery kick of the rum. Before grog, beer was a common drink on shorter voyages, particularly for English ships. The brewing process rendered it safer than untreated water, and it provided some calories. But beer, too, spoiled, turning sour and undrinkable after a few weeks or months. You can imagine the disappointment as a barrel of prized ale turns putrid, another source of liquid lost. Wine served a similar purpose, especially for French and Spanish sailors, often mixed with water to make it last longer. But like beer, its shelf life was limited. The idea of making fresh water from salt water was not new, but practical methods were elusive for centuries. Early attempts involved cumbersome stills on board, using precious fuel to boil seawater and condense the steam. You might witness a primitive still being assembled on deck, a jury-rigged contraption of copper tubing and barrels. The process was incredibly inefficient, yielding only tiny amounts of potable water at great expense of wood or coal. It was a last resort, reserved for dire emergencies, not a sustainable solution for an entire crew over months. The constant battle against thirst had profound health consequences. Dehydration weakened the body, making sailors more susceptible to diseases. It exacerbated the symptoms of scurvy, a devastating illness caused by a lack of vitamin C, which further compromised the body's ability to retain fluids. You see men with swollen gums, bleeding sores, and a general malaise, their thirst made all the more unbearable by their weakened state. The lines between thirst, sickness, and death blurred on the distant seas. Mentally, the constant deprivation was a heavy burden. The yearning for a simple, clean drink of water became an obsession. Dreams might be filled with gurgling streams and cool springs. The monotony of the voyage, the endless expanse of ocean, combined with the gnawing thirst, could push men to the brink of despair. Yet they persevered. This extraordinary endurance, this ability to survive on the ration's edge, was not just about physical fortitude. It was about an unyielding human spirit. It was about the collective will to reach a distant shore, to claim new lands, to trade, to explore. The management of water, its scarcity, its spoilage, its careful rationing, profoundly shaped the nature of long-distance seafaring. It dictated the duration of voyages, the size of crews, and even the routes ships could take. You look out at the same ocean these sailors navigated, and now your understanding is deeper, richer. The vast blue expanse no longer appears merely beautiful. It is also a symbol of relentless challenge. Every drop of water consumed by those early mariners was a testament to their incredible resilience, a defiant act against the indifferent power of the sea. Their survival against such odds opened up the world, one carefully measured, often foul-tasting drop at a time. It is a legacy written not in ink, but in the sweat and parched throats of generations who dared to sail beyond the horizon. You stand on the deck of a wooden sailing ship hundreds of years ago, adrift on an endless, sparkling blue. The vastness of the ocean, so beautiful, so formidable, stretches to every horizon. But the greatest challenge for the generations of sailors who dared to sail beyond that edge was not always the storm, nor the uncharted reef, nor the unknown lands. Often, it was the enemy within their own hold. The water they carried, the very essence of life, turning into a source of sickness and despair. The sweat and parched throats of those early mariners tell a story not just of scarcity, but of a relentless, daily battle for freshness. Imagine the ship's store, deep below your feet. Wooden casks, stoutly built, are packed shoulder to shoulder, filled with the precious liquid. When you first set sail, the water drawn from a shore well might have been clean and sweet. But weeks, then months, crawl by, and change begins to work its insidious magic. The airless environment of the cask, the wood itself, the tiny organisms carried within the water, all conspire. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the water begins to transform. You taste it. At first, a slight staleness. Then a distinct flat flavor. Soon, the transformation accelerates. The water grows cloudy, developing a greenish hue. You might see slimy strands floating within it, or a thick, viscous film coating the inside of the barrel as it empties. The smell, initially faint, intensifies. It becomes putrid, sulfurous, sometimes described as smelling like rotten eggs or a festering swamp. This was not merely unpleasant, it was a grave danger. This putrefaction, caused by anaerobic bacteria and algae, rendered the water not just unpalatable but actively dangerous. Drinking it could lead to severe gastrointestinal distress, dysentery, and other debilitating illnesses that weaken crews already struggling with poor diet and cramped conditions. For long voyages, this was a death sentence slowly delivered. The grand quest for new horizons was often reduced to a daily, stomach-churning fight for a sip of something that would not make you sicker. How then did sailors survive? Their methods were a blend of desperate ingenuity, careful management, and a certain grim acceptance. The first line of defense was the storage itself. For centuries, water was kept in wooden barrels, typically oak or elm. These casks were coopered with skill, but wood is porous. It breathes, it shrinks, it leaks. Over time, the wood itself could impart an unpleasant flavor to the water. Keeping them clean was a monumental task, often neglected until a full overhaul in port. Some coopers would char the inside of barrels, hoping the charcoal would absorb impurities or line them with pitch, but these were imperfect solutions. Later, as maritime technology advanced, iron tanks began to replace wooden casks, especially from the late 18th century onward. You can imagine the excitement of a captain viewing these new large metal containers. They were far less prone to leakage, could be sealed more effectively, and were easier to clean, at least in theory. Yet, iron brought its own challenges. Rust became a problem, staining the water and imparting a metallic taste. The sheer weight of these tanks also added significantly to a ship's displacement, a factor for speed and maneuverability. Still, they represented a significant step forward in the quest for fresher water. But even with the best storage, the water often still spoiled. So, the true alchemy of survival lay in what was done with that foul water. You are handed your daily ration, perhaps just 1 pint or 2. You hold your breath as you bring the cup to your lips. To make it more palatable, sailors often mixed their water with other liquids. Beer and cider were common provisions on early voyages, partly for their caloric content, but also because they kept better than water and could mask its foulness. Spirits, especially rum, became a vital part of the daily allowance, not just for morale, but as a potent disinfectant and a strong flavor to overpower the putrid taste of the water. Imagine the taste of watered-down rum, still tasting faintly of algae, but at least offering some fleeting relief. Sometimes vinegar was added, its acidity cutting through the stench and perhaps offering some antibacterial benefits. Coffee and tea, when available, were also brewed with the tainted water, the boiling process offering a measure of sterilization and the strong flavors again serving as a disguise. This was the daily ritual, the desperate attempt to transform the undrinkable into something merely awful, a triumph of necessity over revulsion. The quest for freshness also meant constantly seeking new sources of water. You watch as a sudden squall approaches, the sky darkening dramatically. Every hand on deck springs into action. Canvas awnings are spread, tarpaulins unfurled, sails positioned to catch the downpour. Gutters and channels are rigged to direct the precious rainwater into barrels. This was a godsend. Rainwater, fresh from the sky, was often the sweetest water sailors tasted for weeks or months. It could revitalize a parched crew and replenish dwindling stores, at least temporarily. You can almost feel the cool drops on your skin, tasting the pure water as it flows. Yet, relying on rain was unpredictable. It meant that for truly long voyages, landfalls were essential, not just for fresh food to combat scurvy, but crucially for fresh water. You anticipate the sight of land with an almost desperate longing. Navigators meticulously planned routes that included stops at known watering holes, sometimes risking hostile encounters with indigenous populations or rival powers. Shore parties, armed and wary, would disembark, often with empty casks on their shoulders, to find a spring or river. But even land-based water sources were not without peril. Wells could be contaminated, rivers could carry disease, and the act of fetching water could expose sailors to tropical illnesses like malaria or dysentery. The irony was brutal. Seeking life-giving water could lead to a swift and agonizing death. Beyond these practical measures, there was a growing scientific curiosity. Could seawater itself be made fresh? For centuries, this was seen as a kind of alchemy, a magical transformation. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, serious experimentation began. You hear of inventors proposing various devices, often crude stills, to distill seawater over the ship's galley fires. Imagine the scene: a makeshift apparatus, perhaps a copper kettle with a coiled pipe extending into a condenser, heated by the ship's limited fuel supply. The steam from the boiling seawater would rise, condense back into liquid, and theoretically be fresh. Early pioneers like Dr. Hales and later Captain Cook experimented with such methods. Cook, renowned for his meticulous attention to his crew's health, made efforts to improve water quality, though his primary focus was scurvy. He understood the vital connection between good water and crew well-being. The challenge with these early distillation methods was immense. They were inefficient, requiring vast amounts of fuel for small quantities of water. The resulting distilled water often tasted flat and unpalatable, lacking essential minerals. It was also a slow process, utterly impractical for the thousands of gallons a large ship and its crew would require daily. While a useful emergency measure, widespread practical desalination at sea was still centuries away. The dream of turning the endless surrounding ocean into potable water remained largely a dream for most sailing eras. So, the daily reality for centuries was one of constant struggle. You watch a sailor, his face gaunt, his eyes red-rimmed, carefully pour his ration from a barrel. He holds his nose as he drinks, a grimace on his face, but he drinks it nonetheless. It is a necessary evil. This continuous battle for water, for something that would not sicken or kill, deeply impacted maritime history. It dictated how long ships could stay at sea, how large their crews could be, and where they could go. It shaped the very routes of exploration and trade. The management of water was a highly prized skill, often overseen by the ship's purser or a dedicated quartermaster. Each cask was numbered, its contents noted, its consumption carefully rationed and recorded. You realize that a ship was not just a vessel for cargo or conquest. It was a floating, self-contained ecosystem, desperately trying to sustain life against the odds. The stories of those who sailed the world's oceans are tales of incredible resilience. They endured not just the fury of storms and the loneliness of vast expanses, but also the daily indignity and danger of their own life-sustaining water turning against them. Their survival against such an intimate and pervasive threat speaks volumes about the human capacity to adapt, to innovate, and to persevere. It underscores the profound truth that sometimes the greatest adventures are simply about staying alive, one carefully measured, often foul-tasting drop at a time. The world was opened up not just by brave hearts, but by stomachs strong enough to tolerate the daily alchemy of putrid water and the ingenuity to keep the quest for freshness alive. You have navigated the complexities of a ship as a living entity, its provisions measured, its very survival an act of profound will. You have smelled the stale air of the hold and understood the quiet desperation that comes with the knowledge that your most vital resource is slowly, inevitably turning against you. The putrid water, that daily alchemy of decay, was not just an inconvenience. It was a constant, intimate threat. It was a foe as relentless as any storm, as insidious as any disease. Yet sailors endured. They found ways to cheat death, not just by avoiding its obvious dangers, but by transforming the very liquids meant to sustain them into something tolerable, if not always palatable. Imagine yourself on deck, under a searing tropical sun, the salt spray drying on your lips, leaving them cracked and stinging. Your throat feels like sandpaper. The thirst is a gnawing beast, a constant companion that overshadows even the hunger. You know it is nearly time for the daily water ration. This moment, eagerly anticipated yet often dreaded, becomes a central ritual of your day. You line up, your wooden tankard held out, watching the purser or the bosun carefully pour out a precise measure from the communal cask. The liquid that splashes into your cup is rarely clear. It might be cloudy, sometimes with a greenish tinge, sometimes a brownish murk. A foul smell, a mix of stagnant pond and something vaguely metallic, might assault your nostrils even before you raise it to your lips. You close your eyes, take a deep breath, and force it down, your stomach protesting, your mind screaming for something, anything clean and fresh. This was the harsh reality of life at sea for centuries. Fresh water, once drawn from a clean river or well, began its slow, inevitable decline the moment it was stored in wooden casks. The wood itself, porous and prone to harboring bacteria, contributed to the spoilage. Algae bloomed, microbes flourished, and the water grew slimy, thick, and utterly unappetizing. Sometimes, worms or insect larvae could be found wriggling within its depths. Sailors learned to filter it, if they could, through a piece of canvas or a rag, hoping to strain out the worst of the visible contaminants, but doing little to alleviate the microscopic dangers or the rancid taste. Boiling was an option for cooking, but a ship's precious fuel stores were not generally expended on boiling drinking water for the entire crew, day in and day out, unless absolutely necessary. Distillation, the process of turning seawater into fresh, was understood in theory, but early apparatuses were inefficient, slow, and consumed vast quantities of fuel, making them impractical for sustained use on long voyages. The technology simply wasn't ready to save them from this most basic need. So they turned to other solutions, to drinks that could better withstand the rigors of storage, or whose very nature made them safer than putrid water. And here alcohol stepped onto the stage, not just as a comfort or a vice, but as a critical life-sustaining provision. For centuries, beer was a staple aboard European ships. Brewed correctly, it was far less likely to spoil than fresh water, its alcohol content acting as a natural preservative, inhibiting the growth of many harmful bacteria. Early voyages, particularly those from northern Europe, often began with an immense quantity of beer loaded into the hold. For example, some ships would carry upwards of a gallon of beer per man per day, a staggering amount, testifying to its importance. It wasn't always strong beer. Often it was a small beer lower in alcohol, intended more for hydration than intoxication. But it was liquid and it was safer. You might have received your daily ration of beer in the morning, a thick, dark, slightly sour brew, and you would drink it knowing it was a lesser evil than the foul water. Mediterranean ships, particularly those from France, Spain, and Italy, often provisioned with wine. Like beer, wine's alcohol content and acidity made it more resistant to spoilage than water. It was often diluted with whatever water was available, creating a more palatable and still safer drink. You would watch the wine casks being tapped, the rich smell filling the air, and for a moment, the harsh realities of the ocean might seem a little less daunting. But perhaps the most famous or infamous of these alcoholic solutions was grog. Born out of necessity in the British Royal Navy in the mid-18th century, grog was a simple concoction. Rum diluted with water, often with a squeeze of lime or lemon juice added to combat scurvy. Admiral Edward Vernon, nicknamed Old Grog for his grogram cloak, ordered the dilution of the sailors' daily rum ration to reduce drunkenness and improve discipline. Unwittingly, he also provided a safer drink. The rum helped sanitize the often foul water it was mixed with, making it more potable. You would gather with your shipmates at the appointed hour, your tin cup ready, waiting for the clink of the dipper against the bung of the rum cask. The potent aroma of the spirit would mingle with the stale air, and then the grog would be poured. It was a potent mix, a blend of solace, ritual, and a pragmatic solution to a deadly problem. For many, it was the only decent liquid they would taste all day. It numbed the pangs of thirst, dulled the aches of arduous labor, and offered a fleeting moment of warmth and camaraderie in the cold, wet reality of the ship. Beyond beer, wine, and grog, sailors also utilized other acidic liquids. Vinegar, for instance, was sometimes carried and occasionally mixed with water to make it more palatable and to provide some antibacterial properties. You might have tried this, a sharp, sour tang that stung your tongue but offered a welcome contrast to the bland, putrid taste of the water alone. Fruit, when available, not only helped with scurvy but also provided much-needed moisture. A ripe orange or a lemon was a treasure, its juice a sweet, life-giving elixir. But these were luxuries, often quickly depleted or subject to the same spoilage as the water itself. Then there was the rain. Oh, the rain. For sailors, a storm was not just a terrifying ordeal of wind and waves. It was also a desperate opportunity. Every square inch of canvas, every bucket, every barrel would be pressed into service to catch the precious, falling liquid. You would see men scrambling, setting out tarpaulins to funnel water into empty casks, eagerly scooping up what they could. The taste of fresh rainwater, clean and cool, was a momentary paradise, a fleeting glimpse of the purity they so desperately craved. It was a gift from the heavens, a brief respite from the constant battle against contamination. The collected rainwater, though quickly subject to spoilage itself, offered a short window of genuine refreshment, a stark reminder of what true hydration felt like. The ingenuity of sailors in their quest for drinkable liquid was a testament to their will to survive. They were forced to become chemists, strategists, and meticulous rationers, constantly weighing the risks of dehydration against the dangers of contaminated water. Their methods, from the daily grog ration to the desperate collection of rainwater, were not elegant solutions. They were pragmatic, often unpleasant, but ultimately effective adaptations to an environment utterly hostile to the most fundamental human need. You stand there now, a phantom thirst in your own throat, having witnessed the lengths to which humanity went to simply exist. The cask, once a symbol of bounty, became a vessel of disease, then, through adaptation, a source of modified sustenance. The story of water at sea is not just about its scarcity, but about its transformation, about the liquids that stepped in to fill the void, sustaining bodies and spirits against immense odds. It speaks of a time when the very act of drinking was an act of courage, a calculated risk, and a daily reminder of the thin line between life and death on the vast, unforgiving ocean. The quest for freshness, for true clean water, drove innovation and shaped the daily lives of those who opened up the world, one carefully measured, often fortified swallow at a time. The ships were not just moving across the waves, they were moving through a constant negotiation with thirst, their crews relying on more than just the wind in their sails to carry them forward. They relied on stout barrels of beer, potent rum, and the occasional blessing of a downpour, transforming the grim reality of the sea into a survivable, if not always comfortable, journey. The ships were not just moving across the waves. They were moving through a constant negotiation with thirst, their crews relying on more than just the wind in their sails to carry them forward. They relied on stout barrels of beer, potent rum, and the occasional blessing of a downpour, transforming the grim reality of the sea into a survivable, if not always comfortable, journey. You stand on the rolling deck of a galleon centuries ago. The sun beats down relentless, reflecting off the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean. All around you, the rhythmic creak of timbers, the snap of sails, the distant cries of gulls. But beneath these sounds, a more insidious presence asserts itself, the silence of dehydration. It is the unseen enemy, more potent and persistent than any storm or pirate. The ocean stretches to the horizon, an endless blue, yet not a single drop is safe to drink. This is the profound paradox of life at sea, surrounded by water, yet constantly dying of thirst. Feel it now, the subtle tightening in your throat, the dryness on your tongue that grows more insistent with each passing day. Your lips chap, your skin feels papery, and a dull ache begins to throb behind your eyes. This is not merely discomfort. It is a slow, relentless assault on your very being. Dehydration steals your strength, clouds your mind, and saps your will. It is the ghost that walks the decks, whispering promises of sweet, fresh water, only to leave you with the bitter taste of salt and despair. How did these sailors, the men who charted unknown waters and connected continents, survive months, sometimes years, without a reliable source of fresh water? Their ingenuity, born of desperation, fashioned a precarious lifeline from what was available. The cornerstone of this survival, the very liquid that stood in for water, was beer. Imagine thousands of wooden barrels, heavy and cumbersome, being hoisted aboard, filling every available space below deck. These are not merely provisions, they are life itself. On many voyages, each sailor received a daily allowance of beer, often a gallon or more. Why beer? Because the process of brewing involved boiling the water, sterilizing it against the myriad pathogens that lurked in stagnant freshwater sources. While weak by modern standards, it was far safer than drinking the dubious contents of a water barrel that had sat for weeks or months in the hold, growing foul and dangerous. You queue for your ration, the smell of stale hops and fermenting grain thick in the air. The beer is warm, flat, and often cloudy, tasting faintly of the wooden barrel it was stored in. It is not refreshing in the way a cool spring water might be, but it provides calories, a mild sedative effect, and crucially, hydration. It is a necessary evil, drunk not for pleasure but for survival. It keeps the dysentery at bay, or at least attempts to. For some crews, particularly those from wine-producing regions like Spain or France, wine replaced beer as the primary beverage. A thin, sour red, diluted with what little water remained, it served the same purpose: a relatively safe liquid to sustain life. Cider, too, occasionally made an appearance, though less common than its fermented brethren. Then there was the rum or brandy, depending on the ship's origin. This was the fire in the belly, the potent spirit that offered a temporary escape from the monotony and hardship. It was not a primary hydrator. In fact, its dehydrating effects were well known. But it served a vital function: morale. Picture the daily ritual: a small measure of rum poured into your cupped hands or a crude wooden cup. This was your grog, often mixed with water to reduce its potency and stretch the precious resource. The taste is harsh, burning a path down your throat, but the warmth spreads, a brief flicker of cheer in the face of relentless hardship. It numbed the aches, offered a fleeting sense of camaraderie, and provided a brief respite from the ever-present thirst. It was a calculated risk, a balance between the immediate psychological boost and the long-term physiological toll. The management of these precious liquids was an art form, a constant battle against spoilage and waste. Water, when it was carried, was stored in stout oak barrels. These were often charred on the inside to help preserve the water and minimize the growth of algae and bacteria. But wood is permeable, and over time, water could leak, evaporate, or become contaminated. Imagine the dread of opening a barrel to find the water slimy, green with algae, or teeming with insect larvae. Filtering through a cloth might help, but the taste and often the danger remained. Rations were strict, enforced with an iron fist. A single drop spilled was a potential life lost. You learned to guard your portion fiercely, to savor every mouthful, knowing that there might not be another for hours or even a full day. The smallest breach of water discipline could lead to severe punishment, for the collective survival depended on every man adhering to the rules. But what if the provisions ran low? What if the voyage stretched longer than anticipated, or storms ravaged the stores? Then the sky became the only hope. Rainwater harvesting was a desperate measure, but a life-saving one. Imagine the scene: a sudden squall, the sky darkening, and the entire crew springing into action. Canvases are unfurled, sails are turned to catch the downpour, barrels and buckets are hastily arranged on deck. The rainwater, though mixed with sea spray and whatever grime clung to the rigging, was a blessing. You hold your face up, mouth open, letting the cool drops cleanse your parched tongue, a primal relief washing over you. Every drop was precious, collected and stored with the utmost care, a temporary reprieve from the tyranny of thirst. Early attempts at desalination, though rudimentary, also speak to the desperation for fresh water. Simple distillation methods involving boiling seawater and collecting the condensed steam were known. But these were incredibly inefficient, requiring vast amounts of fuel and producing only tiny quantities of potable water. They were rarely practical for sustaining a large crew over long voyages, more a scientific curiosity or a last-ditch effort than a regular solution. The consequences of this constant struggle against dehydration were profound and devastating. Beyond the immediate discomfort of thirst, prolonged lack of fresh water led to a host of ailments. The insidious creep of dysentery, often exacerbated by contaminated water or poor hygiene, ravaged crews. You would witness the rapid weakening of shipmates, their bodies racked by fever and debilitating bowel movements, their strength draining away with each passing day. The lack of fresh water also contributed to the overall decline in health that made sailors susceptible to scurvy. While primarily caused by a vitamin C deficiency, a body already weakened by dehydration and poor nutrition was far less resilient. Imagine the swollen gums, the loosened teeth, the aching joints, the deep fatigue. Dehydration made every ailment worse, every recovery harder. Your mind too suffered. Concentration wavered, irritability flared, and decision-making became impaired. The vast, empty horizon seemed to mirror the emptiness within, a profound longing for something simple, something fundamental, a cool, clean drink of water. This daily negotiation with thirst was not just a physical ordeal, it was a psychological battle. The constant craving, the sight of the endless ocean that mocked your parched throat, the dream of a bubbling spring or a cool river, these were the silent torturers. The anticipation of your daily ration, however unappetizing, became the focal point of your day, a brief pause in the relentless grind. When the barrels began to run truly low, when the rations were cut to a mere few mouthfuls, fear truly set in. Mutiny often simmered not just from hunger, but from the unbearable agony of thirst. Yet, despite these immense challenges sailors endured, they learned to adapt, to eke out survival from the unlikeliest of sources. Their journeys were a testament to human resilience, a grim illustration of how the body and spirit can push past seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The liquids they consumed, the beer, the wine, the grog, the collected rainwater, were not just drinks. They were the very threads holding their lives together, allowing them to navigate not only the physical expanses of the world, but also the treacherous inner landscape of extreme deprivation. The story of how they survived without fresh water is a story of enduring hardship, ingenious solutions, and the profound human capacity to find a way, even when pitted against the most fundamental of needs. It is a story etched in the memory of every parched throat, every drop of precious liquid savored, every desperate prayer for rain beneath a merciless sun. You carry this understanding now, a silent passenger on every voyage, knowing the true value of what others took for granted, and the immense cost of its absence. The story of how they survived without fresh water is a story of enduring hardship, ingenious solutions, and the profound human capacity to find a way, even when pitted against the most fundamental of needs. It is a story etched in the memory of every parched throat, every drop of precious liquid savored, every desperate prayer for rain beneath a merciless sun. You carry this understanding now, a silent passenger on every voyage, knowing the true value of what others took for granted, and the immense cost of its absence. Now imagine yourself aboard a wooden ship, a tiny speck on a vast and indifferent ocean. Days stretch into weeks, weeks into months. The horizon is a seamless circle of blue, unbroken by land or hope of fresh supply. Your very existence depends on the water stored deep within the ship's hold, precious liquid hauled aboard in barrels before you ever left sight of shore. These are not merely barrels, they are the fragile repositories of your future, each stave a silent promise against the encroaching thirst. But these wooden casks, the workhorses of maritime hydration, were far from perfect. You can almost smell the musty dampness, the faint metallic tang of iron hoops corroding in the salt air. The wood itself, swelling and contracting with the changing humidity, was prone to leakage. A slow, insidious drip, 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 eating away at your finite supply, leaving you with less and less as the voyage wore on. And even if the casks held firm, the water within was a living, breathing entity. After only a few weeks at sea, it began to spoil. Algae bloomed, a slimy green film coating the inner surfaces. Bacteria multiplied, turning the once clear water into a thick, foul-smelling liquid, often described as black, greasy, and tasting of rotten eggs. You would watch, horrified, as men held their noses, pouring the vile concoction into their mugs. Sometimes it was so thick it had to be chewed before it could be swallowed. The thought alone is enough to churn your stomach. Yet for these sailors, it was the difference between a faint hope of survival and the certainty of a slow, agonizing death by dehydration. This was not a luxury item. It was a matter of life or death, a grim daily ritual. To manage this dwindling and deteriorating resource, strict rationing was paramount. You would line up on deck, your throat already burning, your lips cracked and peeling. The master or purser would stand by a large cask, dispensing a carefully measured portion. Perhaps a single pint or even just half a pint a day. It was barely enough to keep a man alive, certainly not enough to quench the deep, bone-aching thirst that became a constant companion. Every drop was savored, rolled around on the tongue, held for a moment before swallowing, as if to extract every last molecule of moisture. The memory of clear, cold well water from home would haunt your waking hours and infiltrate your dreams. Yet, beyond the stoic endurance of foul water and meager rations, humanity's ingenuity truly shone. The most immediate and often the most effective solution to the water crisis was simply to catch it. When the heavens opened, when a squall descended, the ship transformed. You would see men scrambling, shouting with an urgency born of desperate hope. Sails, once catching the wind, were now angled and stretched to catch the rain. Tarpaulins, awnings, even blankets were deployed, funneling precious rainwater into buckets, tubs, and any available container. The decks would be awash with crewmates collecting the clear, clean liquid, a temporary reprieve from the filth in the casks. The joy, the sheer exuberance on board when fresh rain fell, must have been palpable. For a brief period you could drink without holding your breath, without the metallic tang or the slime. This was nature's bounty, pure and untainted. But rain was unpredictable, a fickle friend. So, a more deliberate solution was sought: desalination. The idea of turning seawater into drinkable fresh water seems obvious today, but for early mariners, it was a frontier of scientific understanding. The principle was simple: boil seawater, and the steam that rises is fresh water, leaving the salt behind. The challenge lay in the practical application. Imagine the ship's galley, already a sweltering inferno. Now, add a large copper still or kettle, constantly boiling vast quantities of seawater over a roaring fire. The steam would be funneled through pipes, perhaps cooled by flowing seawater on the outside, condensing back into liquid form. This rudimentary distillation process was incredibly fuel-intensive, requiring prodigious amounts of wood or coal, a commodity often as scarce as fresh water itself. The yield was also pitifully small, perhaps only a few gallons per hour, barely enough to sustain a fraction of the crew. Despite the difficulties, pioneers like Captain James Cook were at the forefront of these experiments in the 18th century. You can picture him, meticulous and determined, overseeing the setup, observing the slow drip of precious fresh water into a collection vessel. Cook understood that solving the water problem was crucial not only for survival but also for preventing scurvy and other diseases. His efforts, though limited in scale, represented a monumental step forward, proving the feasibility of creating fresh water at sea. Beyond direct collection or creation of water, sailors also relied on alternative liquids, some of which seem counterintuitive to our modern sensibilities. Beer and wine, for example, were often taken on board in large quantities. In the era before widespread understanding of germ theory, alcoholic beverages were often safer to drink than water from dubious land sources. The alcohol acted as a preservative, preventing the rapid spoilage that afflicted plain water. You might find yourself handed a mug of small beer, a low-alcohol brew, thinking of it less as a celebratory drink and more as a daily necessity, a form of liquid sustenance. When these more palatable options ran out, as they invariably did on longer voyages, sailors turned to grog. This infamous naval drink was essentially a mix of rum, water, and often lime juice. The rum was a powerful antiseptic and a mood enhancer, dulling the edge of endless deprivation. The lime juice, we now know, was a vital source of vitamin C, unknowingly combating scurvy. But it also helped to mask the foul taste of the stale water. You would taste the burn of the rum, the sourness of the lime, and the underlying unpleasantness of the water, yet you would drink it because it was your ration, your liquid lifeline. Even vinegar found its place in the fight against thirst. Sometimes, a dash of vinegar would be added to the water. While it certainly did not purify the water in a scientific sense, the strong acidic taste could make the foul liquid marginally more palatable, cutting through some of the slime and bitterness. It was a psychological trick as much as a practical one, a way to make the unbearable just slightly more bearable. The very diet of the sailors also played a role. While dried and salted meats and hardtack biscuits were the staples, exacerbating thirst. Any fresh provisions, however rare, were cherished. The juice from citrus fruits when available was a godsend. Even the moisture in captured turtles or fresh fish provided a temporary, albeit meager, relief from dehydration. You learn to be resourceful, to be opportunistic. Every dewdrop on the rigging, every condensation bead on a cool surface, every speck of moisture becomes a potential source. The constant struggle for water defined the daily existence aboard ship, shaping routines, hierarchies, and the very psychology of the crew. The fear of a dry cask, the desperate hope for rain, the slow, agonizing descent into dehydration if both failed, etched itself into the very soul of every mariner. The story of how sailors survived months at sea without fresh water is a profound testament to human ingenuity in the face of absolute necessity. It is a chronicle of adapting, innovating, and enduring. From the painstaking collection of rainwater to the early, sputtering attempts at distillation, and the desperate reliance on alcohol and vinegar, these methods reveal a relentless drive to survive against the most fundamental of needs. You feel the weight of this history, the echo of parched throats and hopeful gazes turned skyward, understanding that the greatest miracle on the high seas was often simply finding a way to take another sip, and live to see another sunrise. You stand on the deck now, the vast, indifferent ocean stretching to the horizon. The very air around you hums with the memory of that desperate struggle for water. You feel the sun beat down, taste the salt on your lips, and understand that the greatest miracle on the high seas was often simply finding a way to take another sip, and live to see another sunrise. The quest for fresh water was a relentless, existential battle, demanding incredible ingenuity and an iron will. Imagine the ship, a world unto itself, propelled by wind and hope, but utterly dependent on what it could carry, or what it could capture from the heavens. You cast your gaze upward, not to the stars for navigation, but to the clouds for salvation. Rain, you learn quickly, was not just weather, it was life itself. When the first drops began to fall, a hush would descend upon the crew, quickly replaced by a flurry of urgent activity. Every available canvas, every spare sail would be spread wide, rigged to funnel precious rainwater into barrels below. You would see men scramble, a desperate ballet performed on a pitching deck, eager hands guiding the flow, ensuring not a single drop was lost to the unforgiving sea. The smell of wet canvas, mingled with the earthy scent of captured rain, would have been a fragrance more precious than any perfume. Think of the ingenuity. Large sails stretched taut, becoming vast funnels. Smaller cloths strategically placed, collecting the runoff from spars and rigging. Buckets, bowls, even cupped hands all pressed into service. The sound of water drumming on canvas, then gurgling into a cask, was the most beautiful music a sailor could hear. This collected water, though often contaminated with salt spray and the grime of the sails, was still a godsend, rationed meticulously, drop by precious drop. But what happened when the skies remained stubbornly clear? When weeks turned into months under a relentless sun, and the rain clouds were just mocking phantoms on the distant horizon. That is when desperation spurred even greater invention. You move below deck into the smoky, claustrophobic heat of the galley. Here, early attempts at distillation were often undertaken, crude but hopeful experiments. Imagine the scene, a large iron pot bubbling over a fire filled with seawater. A lid, perhaps concave, positioned above it, designed to collect the steam. As the fresh water vapor condensed on the cooler underside of the lid, it would theoretically drip into a waiting trough or spout, eventually collected in a cup or bottle. It was a slow, inefficient process, yielding only small quantities of water, often tainted by the metallic taste of the pot or the smoke from the fire. The fuel needed to boil such vast amounts of water was a precious commodity itself, limited in supply. Yet even a pint of lukewarm, slightly salty, smoke-flavored water was a triumph, a defiant stand against the encroaching grip of thirst. You can almost feel the heat radiating from the stove, the hope and frustration mingling in the stifling air as men waited for those slow, precious drips. Beyond direct collection and rudimentary purification, sailors also turned to other liquids they carried, often as much for their perceived medicinal properties as for hydration. You would be familiar with the sight of barrels filled not just with water but with beer, cider, and even wine. While fresh water was strictly rationed, a certain allowance of alcohol was sometimes provided. Beer and cider, with their lower alcohol content, were seen as safer, more hydrating options than spirits. But even these were limited and could not fully replace water. The irony was not lost. Alcohol, a dehydrant in large quantities, was paradoxically offered as a solution to dehydration. Vinegar, too, played a surprising role. Stored in large quantities, it was believed to ward off scurvy and other ailments, and in desperate times, it was diluted with what little water was available to make a more palatable, thirst-quenching drink. You might shudder at the thought, but to a parched throat, even watered-down vinegar would have been a welcome sensation, a sharp bite offering temporary relief. Consider the meticulous, almost obsessive water discipline on board. Every drop was accounted for. The quartermaster or an appointed officer would be the keeper of the water casks, his responsibility immense. You would witness the daily ritual of water distribution, a solemn affair where each man received his meager ration. Perhaps a pint a day, sometimes less, for drinking, cooking, and minimal hygiene. The thirst that gnawed at your insides would be a constant, dull ache, a companion on every watch, every chore. Theft of water was one of the most severe offenses, met with harsh punishment, for it was a crime not just against property, but against the very survival of the entire crew. You would see the suspicion in men's eyes, the constant vigilance over their own precious allocation, knowing that a single moment of weakness could mean days of agonizing thirst for another. But ingenuity extended beyond just collection and distillation. Sailors also sought moisture from their surroundings in other ways. When a rare calm descended, and the air was heavy with humidity, some might try to collect dew. Canvas sheets spread overnight, absorbing the moisture from the air, then wrung out in the morning to yield a few precious drops. It was a painstaking, often unrewarding effort, a testament to how utterly desperate the search for water could become. You might also consider the food sources. While much of the diet consisted of salted, dried provisions that actually increased thirst, there were moments of unexpected bounty. The capture of a large fish, a turtle, or even a seabird could provide not just sustenance, but also vital fluids from its blood and flesh. Imagine the small, contained excitement, the rapid butchering, the sharing of every edible part, including the vital organs rich in fluids. These were rare feasts, but they offered a momentary reprieve from the relentless dry diet. The sheer psychological toll of constant thirst is almost unimaginable. You would feel the weakness creep into your limbs, the dry, cracked lips, the throbbing headache. The hallucinations, the delirium, were not just tales. They were grim realities for those who pushed the limits of human endurance. The focus of your entire being would narrow to that single, overriding need: water. Every cloud, every wave, every drop of sweat on a comrade's brow would become an object of desperate longing. The history of seafaring is, in many ways, a history of overcoming this fundamental challenge. As naval technology advanced, so too did the methods of water procurement. Over centuries, the rudimentary stills evolved into more efficient designs, capable of producing greater quantities of potable water. From simple copper coils over a pot to more complex multi-stage evaporators, the science of desalination slowly but surely improved, gradually lessening the terrible burden of thirst. Yet even with these advancements, the legacy of ingenuity born from desperate survival remained. The lessons learned through countless voyages, through the suffering of untold numbers of mariners, forged an unbreakable link between human will and the most basic of elements. You carry the echoes of that thirst within you now. You understand the silent prayers offered to rain clouds, the careful sips from communal dippers, the deep, abiding respect for every drop of water. The ocean, which once seemed an infinite source, was also the greatest barrier to life-sustaining liquid. The story of survival at sea is not just one of courage against storms or navigation through unknown waters. It is, perhaps most profoundly, a story of how humanity, when faced with the starkest of necessities, found a way to coax life from the very air and sea around it, ensuring that another sunrise and another sip would always be within reach.